The world, as it is remembered in the oldest stories, does not begin with noise. It begins with stillness, a kind of deep quiet that feels heavier than sound, as if something immense has already passed, leaving only the echo of its absence. In these remembered ages, the land does not rush. Stone, water, and wind exist together without urgency, as though they are waiting for memory itself to awaken. It is in this quiet that the first traces of remembrance appear. Not dates, not declarations, not histories written to be proven, but impressions carried softly, passed from one generation to another, like embers, cupped in careful hands. People did not speak of beginnings as events. They spoke of them as feelings, a sense that the world had once been fuller, heavier, with meaning, and that something essential had stepped back, leaving humanity to listen rather than to receive instruction. In the deep past, long before words were fixed into tablets or carved into stone, memory itself was the archive. What survived did so not because it was enforced, but because it resonated. Some stories clung to the mind the way a dream does upon waking, not fully understood, yet impossible to forget. Among these were the faint recollections of figures who were never fully present. Even when they were near, beings remembered not for conquest or command, but for silence, distance, and withdrawal. These figures would later be named, shaped by language and symbol, given faces and genealogies. In another, teachers. In another, still watchers who came and went. Much later they would be remembered as the Anunnaki, though even that name feels less like a title and more like an echo shaped by human mouths trying to hold onto something already fading. Perhaps they were never meant to be understood clearly. Perhaps clarity was never the point. What lingers instead is a sense that they did not rule loudly, nor dominate through force. They appear in memory as quiet presences at the edges of human awareness. Figures who spoke rarely, if at all, and who left not through catastrophe but through absence. The world these memories point toward feels older than collapse, older than disaster. It is not remembered as ending in fire or thunder, but as softening, as though the structures of a former age simply grew tired, loosening their grip, allowing the world to become something simpler, quieter, and less burdened by instruction. In such a world, humanity does not inherit power, it inherits space. And within that space, memory begins to do its work. The Anunnaki, as they are later remembered, do not arrive with banners or weapons in these stories. They are already there when remembrance begins, already part of the landscape as familiar as the horizon. They are associated with order, not in the sense of law, but in the sense of balance. The movement of water through channels, the rhythm of seasons, the slow learning of how to live beside the land rather than above it. Yet even in these earliest impressions, there is a sense that they are not meant to stay. Their presence feels provisional, like a voice that knows it will soon fall silent. Perhaps this is why they are remembered so gently. People do not cling to them with desperation. They observe, they listen, they remember. When later generations attempt to describe them, they struggle. Language hardens what was once fluid. Names become fixed, but beneath all of it there remains the same quiet impression. These beings did not seek devotion. They did not demand worship. They were noticed because they were withdrawing. It may be that the world itself was changing when these memories formed. The land cooling, the waters shifting, the long rhythms of climate and earth subtly reshaping what it meant to survive. In such times, loud gods would not endure. Only those remembered through feeling, through subtlety. Through a Sozi, Anunnaki become figures of memory rather than presence. They are not encountered directly. They are sensed in the spaces between actions, in the pause before planting, in the silence after a flood recedes, in the instinct to build, to gather, to mark the passage of time even when no one demands it. As civilization began to emerge, much later these memories surface again. They appear as fragments. A name carved into clay, a symbol pressed into a seal, a story told at night that feels older than the language used to tell it. The Anunnaki are now spoken of as ancestors of order, but even here they do not act. They are referred to, not invoked. Perhaps this is because memory has already done what time always does. It has softened the edges, it has removed intention, and left impression. What remains is not instruction, but atmosphere. A sense that humanity once learned something essential, not through force, but through observation, of those who knew when to step aside. There is something deeply human in this kind of remembering. We often recall not the words spoken to us, but the silence that followed them. Not the command, but the moment we were trusted to act on our own. In this way, the Anunnaki feel less like rulers, and more like the memory of guidance that does not linger long enough to become dependency. As the stories continue to drift forward through time, they become entangled with landscape. Rivers are said to have known them, mountains are shaped as though they once stood beside them. Cities are founded in places that feel chosen, though no one remembers why. The memory has outlived the explanation. And then, there is the silence, always the silence. In many traditions, the gods depart in chaos, in anger, in destruction, but here the departure is barely noticed. The next speaks of them as having been present. And soon after, they are simply part of the deep past, invoked only when someone pauses long enough to wonder why the world feels incomplete yet stable. It may be that the Anunnaki were remembered this way because humanity needed them to be. Loud gods create dependency. Silent ones leave space for growth, in a world rebuilding itself after forgotten endings. Perhaps what was needed most was not instruction, but permission to continue. Floods, when they appear in these memories, are not always violent. Sometimes they are described as cleansing, as erasing, without malice. And afterward, there is no voice from above explaining what comes next. People simply begin again, carrying with them the quiet sense that this has happened before. In this way, memory becomes the true inheritance. Not technology, not power, not divine decree, but the ability to remember, to hold on to the idea that the world has ended and begun again many times, and that survival does not require domination, only attentiveness. The Anunnaki fade further into this background as time goes on. Their stories are retold less frequently. Their names become symbols rather than identities. Yet they never fully disappear. They linger in the way ancient cultures speak about knowledge as something received rather than invented, in the idea that wisdom is old and that humanity is always rediscovering what was once gently offered and then withdrawn. Perhaps this is why their silence feels intentional. Not abandonment, but trust. Not loss, but distance chosen, so that humanity could learn to listen to the world itself. And so the question emerges, slowly, without urgency, without demand. What if the Anunnaki did not speak through power at all, but through memory? What if their greatest influence was not what they said or did, but what they allowed to fade, leaving humanity alone with its own capacity to remember, to interpret, and to choose? This thought does not arrive as revelation. It arrives as a feeling, a calm recognition that some things are meant to be learned only after the teacher has gone quiet, that some guidance is only understood in hindsight, and that the oldest stories were never meant to be read as commands, but as mirrors, held up to a species learning how to stand on its own. The world continues, as it always has, layered upon itself. Beneath every city, older stones rest. Beneath every story, older memories breathe. And somewhere within that depth, the Anunnaki remain, not as rulers, not as masters, but as a quiet remembered only through what they leave behind. And memory once carried does not fade easily. It waits. It waits in the way the earth holds warmth long after the sun has set, in the way stone remembers pressure, in the way water follows paths carved long before the first step was taken along its banks. Memory does not announce itself, it settles, it seeps. It becomes part of the background against which all living things learn to move. As generations pass, the world grows louder again. Tools are shaped, settlements gather, voices rise where once there was only wind and water. Yet even as human presence expands, there remains an underknowledge should not be spoken too clearly. In the oldest traditions, wisdom is often described as something inherited imperfectly, like a story heard through a wall, its meaning shaped as much by silence as by sound. The Anunnaki persist within this restraint. They are recalled not as interveners, but as those who once understood the balance between action and withdrawal. In some memories, they are said to have shown humanity how to read the land, how to sense when the river would rise, when the soil was ready, when it was time to move rather than to resist. Yet even these teachings feel indirect, as though humans learn by watching rather than being told. Perhaps that is why their voices are absent. Direct instruction hardens into doctrine. Observation becomes intuition. And intuition, once formed, does not need constant reinforcement. It lives quietly, insight moves forward, memory fractures, stories branch. Some traditions emphasize the gods, others focus on the people. In some, the Anunnaki become distant ancestors. In others, they become symbols of forces no longer present. But in almost all of them, there is a shared sense that something once stood between humanity and chaos. Not as a shield, but as a pause long enough for learning to occur. It may be that the world before remembered floods, before remembered endings, was not more advanced, but more attentive. Survival did not depend on mastery, but on alignment. When the world shifted, as it inevitably does, those who remembered how to listen endured. Those who sought to command were erased, leaving little trace beyond warning. Floods, in these memories, are not sudden catastrophes, but slow inevitabilities. Water rises not to punish, but to reclaim. And when it recedes, it does not explain itself. The land is changed. The people are changed. The Anunnaki, if they are present at all in these moments, do not intervene. They are remembered as having already stepped back, their silence complete. And perhaps this absence is what allows memory to take root, without a voice to defer to. Humanity must interpret events for itself. Meaning is no longer given. This discovery does not come quickly. It unfolds across generations. Each telling of a story smooths its edges. Each retelling removes urgency. What was once fear becomes reflection. What was once lost becomes lesson. Over time, the Anunnaki cease to be characters in these stories and become context, the backdrop against which humanity defines itself. In this way, they are less like gods and more like thresholds, points beyond which direct guidance ends. What lies beyond is uncertainty, but also freedom. There is a quiet dignity in this interpretation. It suggests that the most profound gift the remembered gods offered was restraint, the choice to allow humanity to stumble, to forget, to rebuild, without constant oversight, power expressed through absence, rather than control, and absence, when remembered, becomes presence of a different kind as civilizations rise. When systems can no longer sustain themselves, they soften, fragment, and fade. What remains afterward is not the system, but the memory of having lived through its ending. This is where the oldest myths take root, not at the height of power, but in its aftermath. In the quiet period when survivors look at a changed world and try to explain, not how it ended, but how it continues. The Anunnaki appear here again faintly, not as agents of destruction, but as figures associated with transitions, with the knowledge that nothing remains static, with the understanding that endings do not require spectacle to be complete. Perhaps this is why their stories feel unfinished. They do not resolve, they drift. They fade mid-sentence. Like memories recalled just before sleep, they do not demand clarity. They invite rest in the calm tradition of remembering. Certeus that explains everything leaves no room for living. A story that leaves questions open allows each generation to find itself within the gaps. The Anunnaki, remembered through memory rather than power, become guardians of these gaps. Their silence protects the space where interpretation occurs, where meaning is not inherited whole, but assembled gently from fragments. It is no longer a fixed point to be recovered, but a landscape to be wandered. Each listener moves through it differently, guided by intuition rather than instruction, and so the past remains alive, not because it is preserved perfectly, but because it is never fully resolved. There is comfort, a reassurance that humanity has always lived with uncertainty, and that this uncertainty is not failure, but condition. The remembered gods did not solve this for us. They stepped away, leaving us to carry the question forward. What remains then is not a lesson carved in stone, but a rhythm: rise, quiet, change, remember, forget. The Anunnaki fit within this rhythm, as gently as breath, exhale, absence. Between them, life continues. As night settles and thought slows, this pattern becomes easier to feel. The mind releases its need for answers. The stories soften. What matters is not what is proven, but what is carried. And memory, carried softly, does not burden, it steadies. In this stillness, it becomes possible to imagine a world where guidance was never meant to be loud, where the most enduring influence was not command, but example, not rule, but restraint. And perhaps as the world fell silent in those forgotten ages, this was the final lesson left remembered. A lesson that says, listen carefully. The quiet is not empty, it is full of echoes. Echoes that do not repeat words, but moods. Echoes that surface when the noise of the present recedes just enough for something older to breathe. In those moments, often unplanned, often unnoticed, memory feels less like recollection and more like recognition, as if the mind is not inventing, but remembering something it was always meant to hold. This is how the Anunnaki remain, not as figures standing before humanity, but as impressions embedded within the way. Early people understood continuity, the sense that knowledge does not always arrive through discovery, but sometimes through realignment, through remembering how to see what was already there. As communities grew more settled, as fields replaced wandering paths, the memory of quiet teachers became more symbolic, no longer tied to presence. These figures were associated with principles, balance, measure, timing, not commandments, but tendencies. These qualities were not taught directly. They were absorbed, like language learned by listening rather than instruction. In the stories that formed later, much later, the Anunnaki are sometimes described as judges, sometimes as architects of order. Yet even in these hardened versions, something remains restrained. They do not linger among humans indefinitely. They withdraw before familiarity can dull reference. Perhaps that withdrawal is the reason their memory survived at all. What remains too long becomes ordinary. What leaves too early is forgotten. But what steps away at the right moment becomes myth, and myth has a longer life than presence ever could. The world these myths describe feels transitional, not a golden age, not an age of ruin, but a threshold. A place between what was and what would be. Humanity is not yet alone, but no longer guided closely. Responsibility begins to shift, quietly, without ceremony. This shift is rarely marked by a single event. It is sensed over time. The stories do not say, they say, they are no longer here. A subtle difference, but an important one. Absence is not framed as loss, but as condition, and conditions shape behavior. Without direct voices to follow, people turn to patterns. The movement of stars, the cycles of water, the behavior of animals before change. Perhaps this was always the intention, remembered imperfectly. That guidance would dissolve into environment, that learning would come not from authority, but from attentiveness. The Anunnaki then become associated with thresholds of understanding, not inventors of knowledge, but reminders that knowledge must eventually. There requires participosis, silence and freedom participation. What was once felt becomes narrated. What was once implicit becomes symbolized. Temples rise not because the gods demand them, but because humans need places to focus remembrance. Stone becomes a way to hold what the mind fears it might lose. Yet even these structures speak of restraint. They are often aligned with horizons, with solstices, with movements larger than human control. They do not enclose the gods. They frame the world. They point outward rather than inward. In this, the memory of silent teachers persists. The divine is not housed. It is observed. Sometimes they are singular. Sometimes they are many. Often they are described without moral weight. Water comes. Water goes. Life adjusts. Memory remains. In these flood memories, the absence of divine intervention is striking. No shouted warnings, no dramatic rescues. Survival depends on awareness, preparation, and the willingness to move. Those who listen to land. Those who cling to fixed structures are carried away. Perhaps this is the clearest inheritance of the remembered Anunnaki. Adaptability over dominance. A quiet understanding that permanence is an illusion, and that resilience lies in fleminate grief. Loss is still loss, but it reframes it. Endings are not failures. They are transition. The world does not end. It changes. And humanity again and again learns how to change with it. The stories soften this truth, making it bearable. They transform experience into narrative, narrative into meaning. And within that meaning, the Anunnaki linger as witnesses rather than actors. They do not save, they observe. And in observing, they model a way of being that does not interfere with becoming. As civilizations mature, this model is often forgotten. Power accumulates. Control is valued. Certainty is rewarded. Yet collapse always follows, not as punishment, but as correction, when beliefs leave no room for uncertainty. They suffocate. Afterward, in the quiet that follows, memory returns. People look back and speak of earlier times when the world felt guided differently. They speak of gods who were closer, yet less demanding. Of knowledge that felt inherited rather than imposed. These reflections are not nostalgia. And so the Anunnaki are remembered again, not as saviors, but as symbols of restraint lost and sought anew. It may be that each age recreates them in its own image. But beneath those variations, the core impression remains unchanged. That the most enduring influence is the one that knows when to withdraw. This is a difficult lesson for humanity. We are drawn to presence, to action, to declaration. Silence feels like absence, yet silence, carried properly, becomes space, and space allows growth. As the mind drifts toward rest, these ideas settle more easily. The need to resolve them fades. What remains is atmosphere, a recognition that the world has always been layered, and that each layer carries traces of those who stepped aside so others could continue. The Anunnaki, in this way, are less about who they were, and more about how memory behaves. They illustrate how influence can outlast presence, how meaning can endure without clarity. And perhaps this is why their stories feel suited for the edge of sleep. They do not demand attention, they invite surrender. They remind the listener that not everything needs to be understood to be held. As thought slows further, the question no longer asks for an answer. It rests. What if the Anunnaki spoke through memory, not power, after the world fell silent? The question does not insist. It lingers, like a thought half remembered from a dream. And in that lingering, something ancient feels close. Not present, not gone, but quietly waiting within the stillness that has always surrounded human becoming. The stillness deepens, not as an ending, but as a widening. The kind of quiet that does not press inward, but opens outward, allowing thought to drift without direction. In this space, memory is no longer linear. It moves in circles, returning not to events but to sensations. The weight of humid air before rain, the low hum of insects at dusk, the way firelight once reflected off stone walls built with care rather than urgency. This is where the oldest memories feel most at home in these depths. The Anunnaki are no longer figures at all. They dissolve into presence without form, like the awareness that someone once stood nearby, even after they have gone. You do not see them. You do not hear them. Yet their absence shapes the way you move through the space they left behind. Perhaps this is how they were always meant to remain. As humanity learned to name the world, to separate sky from earth, water from land, self from other, something was inevitably lost. Naming creates distance, but memory resists this sharpness. Memory blurs, it softens edges. It allows contradictions to coexist without resolution. The Anunnaki live within this blur. They are remembered as beings who understood cycles before cycles were explained, who sensed when enough had been given, and when it was time to step back. In this sense, they are less like teachers of knowledge and more like exemplars of timing. They appear in memory not at beginnings, but at departures. Departure, after all, is its own kind of teaching. To leave without destruction, to withdraw without resentment, to trust that what has been observed will continue without constant reinforcement. These are difficult acts. They require confidence not in control, but in continuity. And perhaps that is why these memories endured. They reflect an ideal humanity has always struggled to embody, yet quietly admired. In later retellings, when the Anunnaki are given voices, those voices ought to be crossed, of balances not to be disturbed. Yet the consequences of crossing them are rarely dramatic. They unfold slowly, crops fail, waters rise, societies strain under their own weight. The lesson is not delivered through punishment, but through pattern. Pattern is harder to ignore than command. It repeats, it persists, it waits patiently for recognition. Rise and decline, expansion and contraction, memory and forgetting. The Anunnaki become shorthand for this awareness, a way of expressing the intuition that no phase lasts forever, and that wisdom lies in knowing when to yield. Yielding is not weakness in these stories. It is alignment. When floods return, as they always do in memory, they are rarely framed as surprises. There is often a sense of inevitability, of something long anticipated. People are said to have known, to have seen signs, to have felt the shift in the air, the subtle changes in water and wind. Those who listened survived. Listening, then, becomes the central inheritance. Not obedience, not fear, but attentiveness. The ability to sense when the world is speaking quietly rather than shouting. This ability does not come from power, it comes from humility, from recognizing that the world is not static, and that humanity is not its center. The Anunnaki, remembered as silent observers, embody this recognition. They do not place themselves above the world, they move within it, and then beyond it. As centuries pass and memories harden into myth, this humility is often lost. Gods become rulers, stories become justifications, silence is filled with interpretation. Yet beneath these layers the original tone remains. That melody is restraint. In moments of collapse, when structures fall and certainties dissolve, restraint returns to memory. People look back and speak of earlier times when gods were quieter, when guidance felt less oppressive. These recollections are not calls to return to the past, they are reflections on balance. Each time humanity confronts the limits of control, the memory of silent teachers resurfaces, not as answers, but as reminders. Reminders that the world has endured countless endings, that survival has always depended on adaptation, rather than domination. As the narrative drifts forward, closer to the present moment, the distance between memory and experience narrows. The patterns described in ancient stories feel familiar. Climate shifts, societal strain. The quiet realization that existing systems may not endure as they are in these moments, not because they predict the present, but because they describe a recurring condition of being human, living at the edge of change, sensing that something is ending without knowing exactly what will follow. The Anunnaki in this context are not external beings. They are symbolic of an internal stance, awareness rather than panic, with observation rather than force. They represent the possibility that wisdom does not require constant presence, that influence can persist through memory alone, that guidance, once internalized, no longer needs a voice. As night deepens in consciousness, they become impressions rather than arguments. This is where they belong, not in debate, not in proof, but in quiet reflection. The mind, freed from the need to resolve, allows the images to pass gently. Floodwaters, gliding over land without violence, figures standing at a distance, neither approaching nor retreating, but slow churi. Nin standing astir, the Anunnaki are present here, not as names, but as atmosphere, as the sense that humanity has always lived alongside mystery, and that this mystery has never required domination to be meaningful. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding was the belief that guidance must be loud to be effective. The oldest memories suggest otherwise. They point toward a quieter truth, that what is absorbed through observation often lasts longer than what is imposed. As thought continues to slow, the narrative itself begins to dissolve, not into confusion, but into calm. The words become less important than the rhythm beneath them, a rhythm that mirrors breathing. This rhythm has carried humanity through countless ages. It does not promise safety, it offers continuity. And within continuity, there is resilience. The Anunnaki, remembered through memory rather than power, fit Bafi into this rhythm. They do not interrupt it, they do not dominate it, they align with it, and then step aside, allowing it to continue without them. And perhaps that is the most enduring memory of all. Not who they were, not what they did, but how they left softly, without command, leaving behind not answers, but space. Space enough for humanity to listen, space that does not feel empty but receptive. In that openness, memory does not rush to fill the void. It settles slowly, like dust in a shaft of late light, visible only when everything else grows still. This is the quality that defines the oldest remembrance. Not clarity, not certainty, but patience. The sense that meaning will reveal itself only when force is no longer applied. In such a space, humanity begins to understand something subtle about its own place in the world, not as the inheritor of dominion, but as the carrier of continuity. The task is not to preserve what was exactly as it was, but to carry forward what can survive change. Memory becomes selective, not through intention, but through resonance. Only what adapts remains. The Anunnaki, as remembered through this lens, are inseparable from that process. They are not fixed identities, but transitional impressions, shaping how early people understood endurance. Their silence does not signify indifference. It signifies not with a final word, but with withdrawal. This idea appears again and again in softened forms. Across ancient traditions, the most important figures rarely remain at the center. They retreat to the margins. They are encountered at beginnings and endings, but rarely in between. Their role is to mark transitions, not to manage outcomes. And so humanity learns, slowly, imperfectly, that stability is not achieved by resisting change, but by moving with it. That survival does not belong to the strongest voice, but to the most attentive presence. Over long spans of time, this attentiveness becomes ritualized. Night watches, seasonal observances. These practices do not summon the gods. They align the people with the rhythms the gods once observed alongside them. In this way, the divine becomes less external. The silence left behind is not absence of meaning, but redistribution of it. What was once embodied in distant figures is now diffused throughout the world. The water instructs, the sky reminds, and memory holds it all together. As each generation adds its own layer, the original figures grow more indistinct, but the underlying pattern remains clear enough to be felt. Whenever he pulls gently back toward balance, whenever certainty hardens, silence returns to soften it. This is not a promise, it is a tendency. The Anunnaki endure not because they are remembered precisely, but because they represent this tendency. They are the story humanity tells itself about restraint, about knowing when to step back, about trusting what continues after authority withdraws. As awareness fades further into rest, the distinction between past and present loosens. Ancient floods and modern anxieties feel part of the same long movement. Different expressions of the same rhythm playing out across time, and within that rhythm, there is no urgency to continuity. So it carries forward what it can, and lets the rest dissolve quietly into the background, where it can no longer instruct directly but can still influence through atmosphere, through intuition, through the subtle feeling that some things have happened before and will happen again. The Anunnaki remain there in the background of thought, in the quiet between stories, unchanging in their absence, steady in their withdrawal, not as rulers of a forgotten world, but as reminders that even the most powerful presences may choose to leave. trusting that what they observed would continue without them. And in that trust, something essential was passed on. Not knowledge carved into permanence, not power enforced through fear, but a way of listening, a way of standing within change, without needing to command it, a way of remembering that silence itself can be a form of guidance, when carried gently and allowed to remain incomplete. The world continues in this unfinished way, layered, patient, breathing through ages of forgetting and recall and memory, quiet, imperfect, enduring, gaps listening. The listening does not stop. It becomes quieter, more internal, until it is almost indistinguishable from rest itself. In this final settling, the stories no longer feel like stories. They feel like something the mind has always known, but rarely pauses long enough to notice. The world, layered with endings and beginnings, does not ask to be understood. It asks only to be witnessed. In this state, the Anunnaki are no longer distant figures remembered from another age. They are a posture of awareness, a way of standing back from the impulse to control, a recognition that influence does not require permanence, and that guidance does not need to announce itself to endure. What survives of them survives because it was never forced to remain. Perhaps this is why the memories feel so gentle. They were not preserved through fear, nor etched into the world through dominance. They were carried because they fit naturally within the rhythms of living. They moved as people moved. They adapted as the land adapted. And when they were no longer needed in form, they dissolved into feeling. This is not loss. It is transformation. Humanity, left without loud gods or constant direction, learned something difficult and necessary. That responsibility cannot be deferred forever. That meaning must be participated in, not received whole. That the world does not exist to be mastered, but to be lived within attentively. In this understanding, silence becomes less frightening, but as space. Space where intuition can grow, space where memory can shift from burden to companion. The ancient floods, the forgotten collapses, the quiet endings that did not announce themselves, these become part of a long education, not a punishment, not a failure, but a pattern of renewal that has always accompanied life on this world. The Anunnaki, remembered through memory rather than power, belong to this education. They are not the subject of it. They are its early shape, a reminder, carried forward imperfectly, that knowing when to step aside may be the most profound form of wisdom there is. As the world continues to change, as it always has, it grows softer. It waits for moments when certainty loosens, when control falters, when humanity once again senses that something is ending without yet knowing what will follow. In those moments, the old memory stirs not as instruction, not as warning, but as reassurance that others have stood here before, that silence has followed presence many times, that life has continued, not because it was commanded to, but because it knew how to listen. And so the story does not close. It does not resolve itself into an answer. It simply slows, allowing thought to rest where it began, in stillness. The Anunnaki remain there, not waiting to return, not watching to judge, but existing only as a quiet trace within human remembrance. A trace that says, what mattered was never the power held, but the restraint shown, never the voice raised, but the silence trusted. The world breathes, memory breathes. And in that shared rhythm, nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be said.